things you point out in your book is that food has stories, and you tell the story of the Montreal melon, which might be a good place to start talking about food and cities. Can you fill us in a little bit about that story?
Yeah. Well, I think all food uh, contains within it stories about our culture, our history, our society. It's full of, full of story. But the Montreal melon is a particularly wonderful story in that. The Montreal melon used to be, like at the turn of the century, a popular melon. It was expensive. It was rare. It was sent overseas. It was eaten by kings and queens. It was a famous melon grown in Montreal. And what a strange idea. And then with mechanization of agriculture, it went out of favor, and it was pretty much forgotten. And through the efforts of one fellow who has a nursery, and he was doing some research, and he found seeds of this melon in a seed library somewhere, and he started cultivating it. And there's been a revival, and that's just one amazing story, I think, of the way that I don't know, our foods, the foods we grow, our agriculture. There's stories in everything, and there's a danger in kind of when something goes out of production, when people stop growing it, we lose a part of ourselves and our history.
Right. So let's talk about cities and gardens, because I think that people sort of divorce cities and gardens, right, and sort of have sort of separate solitudes about that stuff. But in your book, you argue that cities are actually a really good place to grow food.
Yes, I think there are a lot of environmental problems that can be traced to a false dichotomy that is so strong in our culture, and it has to do with city and country. And we separate those and say there are things that happen in the city that stay in the city, and there are things that happen in the country that stay in the country. And we don't think about how cities can be places of food production, and if they were, that would connect us with a basic essential need, like to eat, to grow food. It would connect us to our home place. So many things that could happen, good things that can happen when we grow our own food. And in the city, it can teach kids, for example, hey, carrots don't come out of a plastic bag. There's real effort and labor and inputs that go into that. There's someone's, hard work. That's good for kids to know. Like if we foreground the processes that keep us like alive, if we foreground those in the places where the vast majority of us live, I think it makes it harder for us to think that there's this place called a way where we can throw our garbage and produce our toxins and use chemicals and think that they don't actually have an impact on us.
So one of the things you point out is that actually growing food in a city is quite efficient, which I think certainly surprised me. Right?
Yeah. Well, because because we think of cities as places with very little growing room, it forces a kind of economy of scale or efficiency of scale. So people are developing really wonderful ways of growing a lot of food in
like
small.
Square foot gardening.
Yeah, square foot gardening, growing a lot of food in a small space, and that's wonderful. But I also think there is a lot more land in the city than we think. Like if you go and look around at vacant lots, undeveloped land, park spaces that aren't necessarily used for sports or other sorts of things. I'm not saying we have to fill everything by any means. I think there have to be like vacant places where nature just kicks along on its own speed, doing where there's not human management. But I think there's a lot more room in the city where food could be grown, potentially productive spaces, and we just need to look for them and have the will to go through all of the effort to get permission. Or actually, there's something called guerrilla gardening, of course, where you do it without permission, and it's pretty amazing.
Cool. So let's go back to the vacant land idea, because I think a lot of people imagine the country as being a land of
Mm.
manure and fresh soil and stuff, and the city, especially brownfield areas and stuff, may contain heavy metals or other toxins and stuff. So why would I want to grow in that kind of ground? So how do you balance that?
Yeah, what I find very interesting, I give talks a lot about growing food in the city, and, inevitably people respond with, wait, isn't city soil really toxic? Shouldn't it be worried? Like, is it clean enough to grow food? And I always find that a little ironic because, we'll go to the grocery store and buy food that's grown in a country where we have no idea what the health and safety rules are, what the labor practices are, what kind of pesticide laws there are in those countries. So we're, you know, out of sight, out of mind, we don't worry about it. And yet, in cities where we actually have some control, and actually a lot of cities have cosmetic pesticide bylaws now. So actually, if you're growing food in the city, by default, you're growing it organically. Plus, in the city, in your backyard, for example, it's very easy to research the history of your particular plot, wherever it is that you're growing food, whether it's in a community garden in a park, or, in your backyard, or in a container on your balcony. I mean, you can find out so much about the health of that soil. You can do soil tests, you can look at some records, you can phone up City Hall and say, hey, how do I find out about the history of this little piece of land? Was there ever any industry on it? You can find that out. You can have control in a way that you can't when you're getting your food. You're putting in your body something that's grown under conditions that you have no idea about.
And one of the advantages, too, of growing in the city is you're dealing with biodiversity as opposed to the monoculture of some farms, right?
Yeah, amazingly, it's always surprising to realize that actually cities can be better pollinator habitat, for example. In rural areas, sometimes in agricultural areas, there might just be like one crop grown, and that's actually, it's not very diverse for pollinators, for the insects that need, nectar at different seasons, different months, different times of the year. So cities actually often have that diversity in a way that rural areas don't necessarily.
Let's talk about cities, local versus the country. One of the things that you point out is that it's really hard when you actually look at it and look at carbon footprints and look at the cost of growing locally versus getting stuff from other places and shipping it in. It's actually a really difficult equation to figure out what actually makes sense, right? So how do you work that out so that you don't sort of disappear up your own butt trying to deal with it, right?
Yes. Especially in the last 20 years when there's been so much interest and research done into a kind of ecological accounting and life cycle analysis of every single thing. Well, you could get bogged down trying to immobilized, trying to figure out for absolutely everything in your life, everything you eat, everything you buy, everything you're involved in, how it compares to every other possible thing you could be doing or eating or buying, how it compares in terms of the ecological cost. So I think it actually makes a lot of sense to rely on a couple of basic principles. One of which, I believe very strongly that if we can grow food without synthetic chemicals, that's a really good way to grow food. Use nature as a model. That's a guiding principle that I think is a pretty good one. I'm trying to think of examples where that's caused problems. Like if you look at natural processes and use those as your guide, I think that's a pretty good principle. Another one is biodiversity leads to health and resilience. I think that's another kind of basic guiding principle that can really help you when you're trying to make decisions about all kinds of things.
And it's got to taste good.
And it's got to taste good. But the great thing is that the organic, the local, the fresher, all that stuff, it does taste better. It tastes better. So, the industrial, agricultural, complex, global food system is not actually, it does not have taste as its priority. When you're spending the time and effort, or a farmer is spending the time and effort and going to a farmer's market, growing that food, um, taste is pretty important to people who are growing their own food. It's a different thing in the big ag complex.
So let's talk a little bit more about another aspect of carbon footprint and buying local, which is in cities there's poverty, there's neighborhoods that don't have access to good food, there's people who can't shop at farmers markets because it's too expensive, can't strike up a relationship with somebody that grows meat outside the city, and it makes it very difficult for them to grow their own food because they're in apartment buildings that are, cheek by jowl with another one. So how do you reconcile the cost of buying local, buying organic, and the difficulty of growing local for somebody who is strapped in terms of money?
Yeah, strapped in terms of money and time, because if you're working, at 3 jobs to support yourself and your family, you're not going to have a lot of spare time to grow your own food. So I think there are lots of things that have to happen to fix our broken food system, a lot of things, and there are a lot of great people working on those issues. I would say that the way that urban agriculture fits into that as one piece of the solution is to have food production as just a normal part of what we do in the city, so that someone who is struggling to afford fresh food has the option of taking part in a community garden project or a community bulk buying of fresh produce.
And a lot of the food that's grown in community gardens goes to food banks, right?
So community gardens are great ways to help people have access to fresh, nutritious food. There are also great projects like the Plant a Row, Grow a Row, which is a joint project. The Composting Council of Canada is involved with it, where community gardens will grow an extra row of vegetables and donate it to food banks. There's so many wonderful models of communal ways we could be making fresh, nutritious food available and accessible to the people who need it. And I think that should be our priority. That should be one of our main goals, social goals, to make sure that everyone has access to fresh, healthy, nutritious, culturally desired food.
Lorraine, you've been doing this for a long time. You've been growing your own food in your backyard. You've been guerrilla gardening. You've done just about any kind of gardening locally in cities that you can. What difference has it made in your life?
I think that for me, what gardening does, what meeting, it's a very social thing for me. What I love about gardening and what it has done for me is the way it's a connection with people. It's a connection with your neighbor, like where you talk and share seeds and find out what they're growing and you share stuff. It's a connection with your community. I'm involved with community projects, so of growing food or trying to green the city or whatever. And it's just food, I think, is a really great way to bring people together. It's something we all need. It's something we all, need, and many of us love everything about it, preparing it, sharing it, eating it, growing it. It's something that can really bring people together. And so for me, that's what all my, various gardening projects over the years, my gardens, whatever, everything has been about connecting with people.